In 1981, the people of tiny Skidmore, Missouri, got together to figure out what to do with a town bully who had terrorized them for years. What they decided to do and did was to mete him out lethal justice in public, in front of dozens of witnesses, and they got away with it. That is just one of many fascinating tales from history that created a stir for a while, only to fade from memory soon thereafter, following our 20 things about fascinating stories such as that of Skidmore's vigilantes, that were big news for a time, but are now all but forgotten by most. The Terror of Skidmore. Ken Rex McElroy of tiny Skidmore, Missouri, was bad news from early on. Born in 1934, the 15th of 16 children of poor sharecroppers, McElroy fell off a hay wagon in his parents' farm when he was a child and cracked his skull bad enough to require a steel plate implanted in his head. Many attributed the god-awful character he became to that childhood accident. Whatever the reason, McElroy became a delinquent before reaching puberty, a bad kid who grew into an evil man. He got started small with petty thefts, graduated to livestock rustling, and soon escalated into violent assaults and vicious mayhem. He was helped by an intimidating appearance. The adult McElroy stood at over 6 feet, weighed in at 270 pounds, had bushy eyebrows and bushier sideburns and heavily lidded, crazy-looking cold steel blue eyes that sent shivers down spines. A mile-long rap sheet. Ken McElroy piled up a long list of indictments, ranging from burglary to child molestation to rape to attempted murder. His lawyer Richard McFadden estimated that he defended McElroy from an average of 3 or 4 felonies each year. However, the indictments produced no convictions. McElroy so terrorized the residents of Skidmore with his brutality and threats of the revenge he would exact that none dared to testify against him. Livestock owners looked the other way when some of their cattle or hogs vanished, or if the gas barrels used to fuel their farms were emptied. On the rare occasion that a case did make it to trial, jurors received unsubtle warnings, such as rattlesnakes in their mailboxes or shotgun blasts shattering the quiet of the night near their homes. The result was a series of mistrials followed by the eventual dismissal of charges, or outright acquittals. Pedo Ken. In addition to thefts and violent assaults, Ken McElroy was a raging alcoholic and a notorious womanizer. Although womanizer might not be the most accurate term, seeing as most of the females he was attracted to were underage, technically children. Over the years he fathered 15 kids with many women, both in and out of wedlock. Most of his baby mamas barely passed puberty. In 1971, a 37-year-old McElroy met his youngest and last wife Trina when she was 12 years old. 2 years later she was pregnant. When she gave birth, Trina tried to escape his mistreatment by fleeing with her newborn son to her parents' home. McElroy had no intention of letting her get away. The reluctant child bride. Ken McElroy followed the teenage Trina to her parents' home, demanded her return, and would not take no for an answer. Astonishingly, although this was in mid-1970s America, not the 1670s or 1270s, he got what he wanted. When Trina's parents demurred, McElroy shot their dog, burned down their house, then forcibly took her and the baby back home, where he punished her for her defiance. Trina told a local doctor about the abuse and arson, and he contacted social services. Facing child molestation and statutory rape charges, McElroy discovered that if Trina was his wife, she would be exempt from having to testify against him. Since she was a minor, he needed her parents' permission, but he had no trouble getting that after threatening to burn their new house to the ground if they said no. Thus McElroy got a child bride, and the statutory rape charges vanished. An increasingly intimidating reputation. Ken McElroy was illiterate. He had dropped out of school at age 13, without mastering basic reading and writing, but he was nonetheless quite cunning. He knew that his intimidating reputation was his greatest protection, so he carefully went about cultivating and enhancing that rep, as the author of a biography that chronicled McElroy's life and death put it. He knew which people to pick on, the weak people, and he followed through on his threats just often enough to make people believe he was going to do what he said he was going to do. He had a legendary status, and it all got to be bigger than he was. Somebody would hear his name and the legend grew bigger. When he got off on a trial, it grew even bigger. It went beyond just hammering people and being mean-spirited. Penny Candy, the beginning of the end for the town bully. By 1980, Ken McElroy had firmly established himself as Skidmore's reigning thug and town bully. People had been intimidated into putting up with his violent antics for so long that his presence and depredations just became an accepted part of life in that part of Missouri. That changed in April 1980. McElroy's wife and erstwhile child bride, now grown up into a nasty piece of work, told him that 70-year-old Bowenkamp and his wife Lois, owners of the local grocery store, had accused the McElroy's 4-year-old daughter of shoplifting some penny candy. Accompanied by her husband Trina, McElroy returned to the store and subjected the elderly owners to an F-bomb-filled tirade, while her husband vowed vengeance for the affront to his family. Following through on that vow is what finally did him in. McElroy's campaign of terror against the Bowenkamps. Ken McElroy offered the elderly Lois Bowenkamp cash to fight his much younger and stronger wife Trina. When she refused, he set out to turn the Bowenkamps' life into a hell. His antics included parking his pickup truck outside the Bowenkamps' home at all hours of the day and night, and firing off his gun into the air. The Bowenkamps put on a brave face and tried to go about their normal lives. That lack of fear, or at least pretense of lack of fear, in reality, the Bowenkamps were terrified. Even if they refused to show it, infuriated McElroy and led him to steadily ramp things up even more. Finally, one July night in 1980, Bowenkamp was standing outside his store when McElroy drove up, pulled out his shotgun, and shot him in the neck with a deer slug. Skidmore finds its spine. Miraculously, Bowenkamp survived the shooting, and the senseless murder attempt on their beloved elderly grocer finally snapped Skidmore out of the terror spell cast by Ken McElroy. After years of intimidation, the locals had had enough. McElroy was tried and convicted of first-degree assault, his first felony conviction, but remained free on bail pending appeal. The residents banded together and wrote to all and sundry. Letters went to state legislators, the state attorney general and the governor, letting them know that Skidmore lived in fear of the psychopath in its midst, and asking the authorities to do something about it. Their pleas were ignored. In the meantime, soon after his conviction, McElroy was seen in a local bar brandishing an M1 rifle with an affixed bayonet, a clear violation of his bond, and vowing bloody revenge on the Bowenkamps and all who sided with them. McElroy finally gets what was coming to him. Witnesses who saw an armed Ken McElroy told the county prosecutor to request a bond revocation hearing. The people of Skidmore organized a caravan to escort the witnesses to the hearing, but McElroy's lawyer got it postponed. As a resident put it, that was the last straw, that was the last failure of criminal justice. On July 10, 1981, the infuriated townsfolk gathered in Skidmore's American Legion Hall. When word arrived that McElroy was in town, 2 men met him in his truck and told him to leave Skidmore. They were followed by a crowd. As McElroy started his truck, some men hustled his wife Trina out of the passenger seat, and gunfire erupted. When the shooting stopped, McElroy lay slumped against the steering wheel, the engine revving at maximum RPMs with one of his feet jammed down on the accelerator. Nobody called an ambulance, and everybody just went home. The Unsolved Murder. When state troopers finally arrived in Skidmore, the streets were deserted, quiet except for the rumbling and smoking engine of McElroy's pickup that nobody had bothered to turn off. Shell casings from at least 2 firearms were recovered, but the weapons were never found. Although at least 40 people had witnessed the public killing, the people of Skidmore kept mum. State and federal grand juries were convened, but other than McElroy's wife Trina, nobody was inclined to say anything, and her testimony was deemed too weak by the prosecutors. To this day, although it happened in broad daylight in front of dozens of witnesses, the killing of Ken McElroy remains an unsolved homicide. As his lawyer put it, "I know why they didn't talk. They were all glad he was dead. That town got away with murder." The Saipan Stare. In the closing days of the Battle of Saipan, in July 1944, photographer W. Eugene Smith snapped a photo of a U.S. Marine that captured the weariness and wariness of combat as few photos have before or since. It appeared in Life magazine with the caption, "Surrounded by the enemy with bullets whizzing from all directions, this soldier jerked his head around as one bullet cracked uncomfortably close. He was about 100 feet from the front lines on the day after the famous breakthrough on Saipan, and had been practically hand-driving Japs out of their pillboxes. More than 2,000 Japs were killed in the drive to the sea." Decades later, controversy erupted about the identity of the photo's subject when a Santa Fe bar owner claimed that it was of his father, Angelo Clonis, an OSS operative, and that it had been taken in Europe, not Saipan. Who was the Saipan Stare Marine? The Clotis claims were taken at face value at first, but subsequent research debunked them. Angelo Clonis was not an OSS operative, but an army cook whose unit's baptism of fire occurred in France, 2 days after the iconic photograph was taken in Saipan. Evidence supports that the photographer correctly labeled the photo for what it was, that of a Marine in Saipan. The subject is wearing Marine camouflage cover on his helmet, is clad in Marine dungarees, and his equipment is secured by Marine straps. Photos before and after on the photographer's contact sheet depict personnel with unit patches of the 1st Battalion, 24 Hours Marines. Finally, the photographer's original caption for the image reads T.E. Underwood, 24th Bat, St. Petersburg, Florida. There was a Private First Class Thomas Ellis Underwood from St. Petersburg, Florida, who fought in Saipan serving as a squad leader with Company B1 per 24 Marines. He fought in Iwo Jima the following year under Bronze Star and was killed in action at age 22. The glorious Hellenistic general who came to an inglorious end. King Pyrrhus was a Hellenistic general and statesman who reached the heights of glory before reaching an inglorious end. A distant relative of Alexander the Great, Pyrrhus was a formidable enemy of both the Kingdom of Macedon and a rising Rome. His costly victories against both gave rise to the term Pyrrhic victory, a victory that comes at such a high price that it amounts to a de facto defeat. Pyrrhus was born to struggle and strife. His father was an epirote who got dethroned when Pyrrhus was 2 years old, and the family had to flee and seek refuge with a nearby Illyrian tribe. His tribal hosts put Pyrrhus on his father's former throne in 306 BC, but he was dethroned 4 years later, and forced to hit the road and make a living as a mercenary officer. Ascending the heights. Pyrrhus ended up in Egypt, where he married King Ptolemy I's stepdaughter, and his new in-law gave him financial and military backing that restored him to the epirote throne in 297 BC. Pyrrhus then spent the next few years making a name for himself as a brilliant general in a series of conflicts in the Balkans. In 282 BC, the Greek city of Tarentum in southern Italy got into a dispute with an expansionist Rome and turned to Pyrrhus for help. Encouraged by a prophecy from the Oracle of Delphi, and eager for an opportunity to create an empire in southern Italy, Pyrrhus agreed. He formed an alliance with the neighboring Kingdom of Macedon, and landed in southern Italy in 280 BC with an army of about 20,000 infantry, 3,000 cavalry, and 2,500 archers and slingers. A silly end. Pyrrhus defeated the Romans in costly battles whose losses he could not afford, but which the Romans with their deep manpower reserves could. After one such victory he quipped, "If we are victorious in one more battle with the Romans, we shall be utterly ruined." Taking a break from Italy, he took off to fight the Carthaginians in Sicily, but by the time he returned, the Romans had recovered and formed a vastly superior army. So Pyrrhus cut his losses and left Italy in 275 BC. His end came in 272 BC, when he took sides in an internal dispute in the city of Argos. An old woman threw a tile from a roof that hit Pyrrhus in the head, knocking him off his horse and snapping his spine. Whether or not he survived the fall, his fate was sealed when an enemy soldier rushed in and beheaded the epirote king. The Vikings in Constantinople. In the 9th century, Vikings from Sweden penetrated deep into today's Russia and the Ukraine, and by 850 they had formed their own principalities in Kiev and Novgorod. From there they dominated the surrounding Slavs as a ruling caste of a new civilization that came to be known as Kievan Rus. The princes of Rus tended to hire new fighters from Scandinavia, who were known as Varangians, a term meaning a stranger who had taken military service, or a member of a union of traders and warriors. By the early 900s, some of these Varangian Vikings had ventured further south, sailed across the Black Sea and raided Constantinople and the Byzantine lands. Some, however, took service with the Byzantine emperors as mercenaries, and as early as 902, contemporary records describe a force of about 700 Varangians taking part in a Byzantine expedition against Crete. The long history of the Varangian Guard. Mercenary units seldom last for more than a few years before they are disbanded. Once the conflict that gave rise to their creation is concluded, the Varangian Guard were an exception, and their history as a mercenary unit lasted for hundreds of years, stretching from the early 10th to the 14th centuries. In 988, Byzantine Emperor Basil II sought military aid from his ally, Prince Vladimir I of Kiev. The Rus ruler sent 6,000 of his most unruly warriors, whom he was having trouble paying anyhow, the emperor put Vladimir's discards to good use against his enemies, then organized them into what became the nucleus of the Varangian Guard. As foreigners, the Vikings had no local ties and thus few political links that could enmesh them in the Byzantine court's intrigues and cabals that made them suitable as bodyguards. They were not just palace soldiers, however, but accompanied the emperor on campaign and formed the Byzantine army's shock infantry. The flight of the wild geese. In 1690, England's newly crowned Protestant king defeated his Catholic predecessor, James II, at the Battle of the Boyne in Ireland. James fled to Europe, leaving his mostly Irish Catholic supporters to try and retrieve the situation. Despite their best efforts, the Irish Jacobites were decisively defeated at the Battle of Aughrim in 1691 and forced to capitulate. Peace was concluded with the Treaty of Limerick, signed in October 1691. It offered favorable terms to Jacobites willing to swear allegiance to William III. Those unwilling to do so were allowed to leave Ireland en masse and join the exiled James II in France, in what came to be known as the Flight of the Wild Geese. Roughly 14,000 men, accompanied by 10,000 women and children, left Ireland for France. The Badass Wild Geese. The Wild Geese took service as mercenaries, and for the next century, the French army included an Irish brigade whose nucleus was the exiles of 1691, its ranks constantly replenished by new arrivals from Ireland. French ships smuggling brandy and wine into Ireland usually smuggled out recruits for the Irish brigade, who were often listed in the ship's log, in a nod to the 1691 Corps as wild geese. Many new recruits sought adventure, others simply wanted to make a living, and most were looking for an opportunity to fight the English. Thousands of Irishmen thus served France, fighting in her numerous wars, and proving instrumental in some notable victories against the British, such as at the Battle of Fontenoy in 1745. After the French Revolution, the unit's existence as a separate entity came to an end, when foreign regiments were integrated into the French Army's line infantry. The real-life Raven King. The Raven King's mercenary black army sounds like something from George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire. It actually refers to a real-life monarch and military unit, who became Europe's most formidable warriors in the second half of the 15th century, to wit King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary, whose name translates as Matthew the Raven, and a mercenary army he assembled to hold back the Ottoman Turks. When Hungary's King Ladislaus V died childless in 1457, the Diet of Hungary convened in January of 1458 to elect a new king. It eventually chose 14-year-old Matthias Corvinus as a compromise to end a civil war between rival factions. The plan was for Matthias' uncle to rule as regent until the new king came of age, but the teenager surprised everybody by administering state affairs independently from the start.